So this is okay. I was pursuing my master's degree back in 19, 1996 to 2001. I was getting deep into my master's degree, and I think about 2003, I had one more class to take. It was a research class, and I was enrolled at Heron, and I was like, gosh, this research class is really, this is tough stuff. And of course, I was like a wild bachelor back then. And so, so there was this lady in there who she was a graduate student, a doctoral student, and she was taking the research class too. And I just struck up a conversation with her, and she seemed really interesting, and she had done research, a lot of research before me. And of course, I'd already been teaching art for many years at that point because I started in 1984. And this lady was so kind and generous, and she was sharing information and knowledge with me. And she helped me, she proofread some of my writing, and it was Marjorie. She helped me get through that research class, and I will always be in her debt. So, and we've remained very close friends ever since then. She has such a generosity of spirit and generosity of professional. I just a generative individual, a true Marjorie is born to teach. The idea of art is a big subject, and that's something that Diane Jakewith, who's a good friend of mine, she said art is a very big subject. And how do you want to teach art to a hugely diverse group? And so the way, with respect to TAB, which overlaps with so many kinds of curriculum structures and philosophical points of view. I'm going to write this list. Obviously, TAB overlaps with Ubuntu. It overlaps with rhizomatic curricula. It overlaps with Deweyan democratic education. It overlaps with Reggio. It overlaps with Pinar's notion of carrere. It overlaps with the surrealist idea of duende.
Earlier, about how you can teach any child, because tab and choice allows for the opportunity for each student to approach these conversations, approach this time of making. So I'm curious though what you think about specifically about that Pinar theory there of how does that really go into, from the perspective of a teacher, how does the teacher see that, and how does Pinar kind of connect with that curriculum, that idea of how we create the experience of the classroom? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, Pinar is, first of all, Pinar is like, he's kind of a badass revolutionary with respect to curriculum. And I like what he says about curriculum. It should be not a static noun, but an active verb. And you think about the rigidity of curriculum today,
yeah,
slowly catching up because of COVID and new attempts to recognize that mental illness amongst juveniles and teenagers is skyrocketing because of the rigidity and the pressure that's placed on children in institutions, institutional K-12 settings. And Pinar, his work is relevant because what he says about the act of study and within the K-12 curriculum study, because we're all natural learners, how are you going to focus your natural capacity for learning? And he's really interested in Michel de Montaigne's stance on study, and he takes off on de Montaigne, the 16th century French philosopher. His thoughts on study is that it should be self-directed, it should be interest-based, interest-driven, it should be emergent, and it should be based on the complicated conversation that you can have with other learned individuals, with your teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's a huge teacher advocate. So the teacher has an important role to play in that the student can have complicated conversations about possibilities. The kids, I said, well, I can either task you or you can task yourself. And, it's much more fun to task yourself. And, here's some ways of thinking about tasking yourself. It's much better to share power than it is to use it on people. And that's what we do in a TAB classroom. And so sharing power is much more fun.
I like that a lot. I like what you said of that the way that you framed it of here are some ways of tasking yourself, because I think oftentimes when art educators or those who are outside of the specialization, they hear tab, they hear choice, they hear the word choice, and automatically for a big red X comes up. Yeah. And every sort of conditioning they've received in their education or their personal life, it just says no. So I think, one thing that I'm really looking to frame for tab and choice is that it is structured, it is valid, it's an authentic learning experience that is a little bit more complex than maybe something that's just based in DBAE, which is not to say that we don't, incorporate components of it.
What I've been trying to nudge my people towards since I've taken the position really is getting away from those cookie cutter, how, please God, can we give the kids more choice in what it is you do? And I do defer to them to some degree about, the level they teach, because I have really high expectations. And I think all the stuff that kids can do at certain ages, and, they're like, well, they can't do that, or they can't even glue, they can't even cut. So yeah, so I would love to learn more about tab and choice and the continuum, right? The vertical continuum, and what that looks like. And even though curriculum is a verb, what does it look like when you're designing it? And then what does it look like when you're doing it? That's all.
So there's a lot to unwrap. If you have that book, Engaging Learners Through Art Making by Kathy Douglas and Diane Jaquith, and there's a lot of other guest authors in there, and myself and Clark Freilich we've authored a couple of bits in that book, and so it's a great book to get your staff to look at. And but really, I would say, people say, well, some people say, well, I'm not going to offer choice because it's maybe their behavioral instinct and their pedagogical instinct is not to give up control. But I found that by giving up control, I gained more control. And so it's kind of a contradiction inside of a mystery, inside of a conundrum, but it really does work. And but I have to tell you, the secret to TAB is the room setup. That's the secret.
I put a link that I'm gonna share with our cohort, and it's a tour of Clark's room that I believe it's your voice.
Yeah.
Are going through and discussing not only the setup of the room, but just like the evolution of the room and how it's like an investment, like it doesn't just happen the first year. You grow, you learn, your room reflects that. And so that art studio tour, I loved that made my heart happy as someone who is very concerned with how space and place plays a part on our experience in general. So Becca, if you haven't watched that, definitely watch that too.
Yeah, the room setup, and that's where TAB overlaps with Reggio. Mm-hmm. Because in Reggio, the adults set up a learning situation. And of course, the adults document the learning and interact with the learners also. Was it Becca or as you had mentioned, what is the continuum of TAB? Well, of course, there's what the teacher provides, their formal, the formal curriculum and the formal content that the teacher delivers. There's always that. That is something, we call that the 5-minute lesson. That can be incorporated also in the room as an advocate. And whenever I talk to administrators, I read them the Riot Act about mental health and mental illness and its connection to curricula and childhood stress, and how schools basically have removed play in the curriculum. They've removed the biological need for play in the curriculum. They begin at kindergarten to regiment behavior and mechanize and bureaucratize the child's existence in K-12 ed. And this is like, when you look at what is the amount of time that a child spends during during the formative years of their childhood, how much time do they spend in school? Well, it's 16,000 hours. 16,000 hours. And we take away play, we take away socialization, we take away their natural capacity for self-directedness and curiosity, and regiment it with a curriculum of test preparation and radical behaviorism in order to make them comply with the test prep. So I would just simply say to administrators who would want a rationale for why should I have a TAB program in my school, and I would just tell them, well, look what you've got there. And by the way, if you want your kids to really like school, you should return these basic these basic fundamental human activities and ways of living and being to them.
So we wanted to talk a little bit about the common misconceptions and criticisms of TAB, and we kind of touched on that. Becca brought up a personal kind of connection with this. So Becca, do you want to share that of like kind of what you've seen with the hesitancy?
Well, I think it's probably coming from two different directions. There's a little bit of like administrative, right? Like our teachers in specifically elementary, probably, also middle, probably, are afraid to do anything that they imagine is not super structured, because if an administrator walks in and sees, you know, kids out of their seats and moving around and this and that, and there's that, and like what's happening, so there's that fear of the evaluation, but then there's also legitimately the misconception, like I say TAB to my teachers, and it's just like, oh, it's crazy, it's just like the Wild West, you can't do that, it's like just chaos.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
debunk that.
So yeah, it's like kids are excited. They're excited to be, they're happy. Kids vote with their feet. And so they're excited to be able to have a conversation with each other. They're excited to be able to socially engage with their classmates. And so what I would say to an administrator who is coming in to observe my class, I would just explain that everybody is working they form their own problem. It's in project-based learning. In project-based learning, typically the teacher sets the parameter of the project, what the project is going to be. In a TAB, they form the problem. They formulated the question. In a TAB classroom, the learners are formulating the problems and formulating the questions, and so they own the entire process. They own the content. They own the methods. They own the time from which they are going to the sequence of the events. And of course, some of them don't know what might be next, what might be the next step, and that's why the teacher is so critical. And it's not like the children are doing anything they want. They're still in the content area of art. Okay, Becca, what the question was, how would I sell TAB to administration?
Well, and just the misconceptions for art teachers as well.
Oh, yeah.
When they think about choosing TAB, that it's scary to them because they think it will be disorganized and unstructured.
Yeah.
Yeah, the room is structured. The room is an integral part of the structure. The room is like a 4-dimensional lesson plan because you're in the space, and it provides inspiration, access to material, directions, and so you can be self-directed. And if the teacher, the great thing about TAB is, and Kathy Douglas would tell you this when she was first experimenting with the TAB concept, she would tell you that she was really good at setting up her room. She would do her initial 5-minute lesson might be about doing one activity, like she might talk about drawing a landscape like Georgia O'Keeffe in her lesson, or using the dividing the paper into 3 parts to make a landscape, like background, foreground, middle ground. And she would show them how to do that in the initial 5-minute lesson. But then after she said, okay, it's studio time, and her lesson was over and the 5-minute lesson's done, and she said, okay, you guys can go back to your existing works of art or work on a new activity, or you can work on the lesson that we showed you today. Well, no, nobody would pick her lesson that she introduced. They all had their own ideas of what they wanted to do. And she said at first her feelings were hurt that nobody wanted to do her lesson. But then she understood that, the children had their own, they had their own minds and their own ideas. And getting back to, the concept of the idea, the art idea. Children can come up with their own ideas. It doesn't matter, what your cognitive situation is. You can come up with your own art ideas given time, opportunity, and material.